Great games at your table. I'm Jonathan Albin. This is Nikos RPG, and I'm a little bit late today. Sorry about that. But doesn't matter. Whatever time you get to see this is as good as enough time for me. So I am a 50-year game master, and today I'm going to share some of the reasons why I've become a storyteller and a game master, and how you can become one too as well. But before we get into all that, make sure that you go down below and hit all the buttons so that the algorithm will know that you're part of our audience. Let's get started, shall we?
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame, or strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
Alrighty, so the story of being a game master started 50 years ago, give or take. I was 11 years old at the time, and I was a member of a war games club. Now, it seems like a pretty early age to be involved with war games, but I was rather precocious and always did appreciate stuff that was before my time, so to speak. And it was a lot of fun because it was a way to interconnect with people who were older than I was in a way that they weren't either intimidated or terrified to be in the same room with me. As a youngster, we were in that time frame in particular. We were playing a lot of Mustangs and Messerschmitts, which was a miniatures game based on World War II aircraft by the name, obviously. And the idea was you were using scale model aircraft to play as the pilots of aircraft. So even though it was a miniatures-based game, it really was kind of a role-playing game because you were keeping track of your sorties and missions and which aircraft you flew and how many enemy aircraft you tagged and all that kind of thing. So it was exciting and interesting and associated with imagination because you were thinking and considering what it was to be that pilot and what decisions you would have to make. But having that as a hobby is a far cry from having it as an occupation. And I'm going to tell a story about a gentleman in my life, and it really taught me a lot. I was at the time, and this is 1999. No. Yeah, 1999. And I was working with the Game Manufacturers Association. Had just gotten started. And we were dealing with new companies coming onto into the organization, Gamma, and establishing not only their identity within the games industry. Back then, we actually controlled the standard manufacturers codes as part of Gamma, and since then that's gone by the wayside. But the idea was that each new manufacturer would have to be provided a standard manufacturer's code, which all retailers would use when ordering their product, and all distributors were using the same code system to make it equitable for everybody to get that information faster, easier, and you didn't have to have all the different sets of order types and such. At any rate, the duty of the Game Manufacturers Association fundamentally is to support the manufacturers in the pursuit of retail sales. And often companies would come to the Gamma offices in Colorado and basically present their product and their pitch, not necessarily from the standpoint of selling Gamma on the idea, because of course Gamma wasn't involved directly in the retail distribution network. We were just advisors and service providers. But nonetheless, the executive director of the organization at the time, Mark Simmons, was well respected, and many people came to get his advice on how to get started and such. And one afternoon, a guy came in, enterprising young gentleman who happened to be a by day lawyer. He worked with legal defense. I don't remember exactly where, but he had a new idea for a role play game, and he was wanting to get Mark's take on it. And it was early in my time with Gamma, so that I was actually asked to sit in on this meeting because I was involved in the marketing aspect of games products, and so he wanted to get my take on how to help this young person present their property. And I say young person, but he was older than I was by probably a decade at the time. At any rate, he was making his presentation, and Mark asked a bunch of particular questions. How many copies did the man already have in publication? Had he done any form of retail sales beforehand with his product? Did he have any retailers that were nibbling at the door knocking at the door, who wanted the product and nibbling at the bait? That was weird. Anyway, so the guy was perfectly honest and told Mark that no, he hadn't done any earlier pre-sales and didn't know how to get a hold of retailers directly, and certainly didn't have any concept of distribution. And then Mark got to the important question, asked him how many copies of the property had he already printed. And the guy said, well, based on the economy of scale, I produced 10,000 copies, and they're all sitting in my garage. And at that point, I thought Mark was going to say, great, let's get started. Let's get you hooked up. Let's get you into the distribution network. Let's make some phone calls, blah, blah, blah. No. He turned to the guy, just straight face right across the table, and said, I'm sorry, but don't quit your day job. If this is what you want to do, whatever you do, don't quit your day job. And I was stunned. To me, that was like the worst thing you could say to a guy that had invested this many hours. I mean, the property he produced was almost a 300-page tome, this really big, thick instructional manual. And it was the player's guide and DM's guide and monster manual, if you will, the way Dungeons and Dragons would do it, but all in one volume. So you could have the entire story in one book. And it was beautiful as far as the art in it. It had a steampunk kind of a vibe to it, and was very detail oriented in terms of the weapons and the way in which engagements would occur. And I mean, it was just a beautiful piece of work. But Mark told him, don't quit your day job. And I was crushed personally on behalf of this guy. I was thinking, oh my goodness. So I waited until Mark and the gentleman had said their goodbyes or whatever, and the guy left us obviously quite dejected. And I looked at Mark and I said, why in the world would you say don't quit your day job to a guy that had done all of that investment in this property? I mean, this is obviously something he wants to do instead of a day job. And he said, Jonathan, you missed the point. You missed the point. You see, and this is Mark, of course, speaking. He said, the issue is that when you go to this level of investment in your hobby and you put this many dollars into it, you have two choices. You can either stay with it as a hobby and play along the edge of it and go to the conventions and make a few retail sales and maybe reach out to a retail distributor at some point, but you don't know the ropes. You don't know what you're doing. So you have really two choices. Either you stay in it as a hobby and don't expect to make a lot of money off of it and slowly filter out your inventory and eventually perhaps sell all of your property. He says, or you make it your day job. You change your perspective on what you're doing. If this is what you want to do, if producing games is really what you have as your agenda, then by all means, go full guns, go full bore, spend every day making phone calls. And that's really what it comes down to is that you have to choose whether you want that, which day job do you want, because if the hobby marketplace is your place to go, it's still going to be work. And this gentleman came to us thinking that Gamma was going to be his panacea, and it isn't. He's going to have to do the work. And so telling him not to quit his day job really was saying, whichever path you want to go on, pick one. You can't do both. You can't have all of the joy of the games business if you don't mind also doing the work of the games business. And that's what he was saying. So, as my grandfather would say, I told you all of that to tell you this. When you are a game master, when you are a storyteller, it isn't just something you can pick up and pitter with. Yeah, there are people who do. Don't get me wrong. There are people who are game masters who literally pick up the book one day and naturally start doing the storytelling part, and then they may have gotten trapped in it, and so they're continuing to do it. But if they're not invoking this day job mentality, if they're not considering it to be 100% of what they want to be, then the output for the players is never going to be quite as adequate as it would be if they did go whole hog. Now, does that mean anybody has to do what I've done? No, of course not. But that is to say, make sure that you have an idea of what you want when you become a game master. And that story has stuck with me all these years, because every time I see somebody who is running a game but they aren't able to get the satisfactory number of players, or they're running a session and they have to bicker and fight with their players every week over rulings. If they have, there's so many different issues. If you've got a drama with it, then don't quit your day job. Either you get better at it, or you just accept that this is the way it's always going to be. And I'm not advocating either way, but what I am saying that here, just as we're starting, my experience has always been to want to be a game master, and we're going to talk today in these different points about precisely why. And of course, I'll relate some other stories and maybe even drop some Easter eggs about the games that I'm currently running. We'll see how that goes. All right, so this is probably one of the most interesting parts of this, is that when you are a storyteller, you have to have stories to tell. And I really am a great fan of Benjamin Franklin. He said that if you want to be renowned, if you want to be known, you either have to write something worth reading or do something worth writing about. And in the case of a writer, I can say that I've been successful in that I have published close to 300 books in the last 10, 12 years. And of those, 10 of them I've published under my own name, but I'm also a ghostwriter and a spec writer. So people have hired me to write for them stories across a whole span of different genres. And role-play games are really a great way to use literary skills, not only in terms of what you are gathering for resources by reading, but also by being the storyteller. Whether you are a full-on novelist-style narrator and you write everything out longhand or even in note form, the point is that the items, the elements that you create are really great interpretations of what you have in your head. And the ability to express that in a verbal form or a written form is a skill that really not that many people pursue. Now, there are people who are spokesmen for companies and such, but generally speaking, they are not the creators of that material. Generally speaking, they are mouthpieces, and that's okay, but that is not the same thing as being the creator or the storyteller. So if you have a love for literature, the role-play environment is a great place to go. As a matter of fact, I know that there is a subsection of role-play now that's called Lit RPG, and I'm not quite familiar with what they are referring to when they speak of Lit RPG, but it appears that they're talking about reading narratives and kind of creating your own interpretation of the narrative in terms of how you would have played the personas in the story. And again, that to me, that's not quite to the level of where I'm going with this, but the idea of literacy is critically important to role-play games, and that doesn't necessarily mean written form. I do know there are players of role-play games who aren't literate at all. As a matter of fact, I have surprisingly run games at a convention wherein 3 or 4 of my players were adults who did not know how to read or write. And roleplay was still a great way to convey information to those people. And it also was a way to express, for example, greater literary works to an audience that either is unaware of it or hasn't yet achieved that level of reading. I mean, for example, running adventures in a world of vampires means that you probably have to have at least a passing understanding of Bram Stoker and perhaps the other formats of the vampire story. But the idea, though, is that if you're telling a love story, you can do it through horror or you can do it through fantasy or comedy. And roleplay games give you a great place to bounce off the ideas you've read in other sources to make the game come alive for the players. A second reason, one of the main reasons why I became a game master is that as I got older, well, first of all, even when I was a youngster, I was an oldster. My friends used to say I was an old soul, that I was, well, I think I told the story before. When I was 5 or 6 years old, we were in the city of Chicago, and they were doing one of those man on the street interview processes, and my dad was carrying me down the street one afternoon, going from place to place, and they of course asked him, about what I was going to do. It was I think it was a summer issue, and they're talking about how kids start thinking about what they want to be when they grow up, and asking a bunch of little kids. I believe this is when Art Linkletter was on TV with a show about strange things that kids say, and so the news anchors were looking for that same kind of soundbite, and so we were all walking past this reporter, and the other kids that were ahead of me in the group, you could hear them say things like they wanted to be firemen, or they wanted to be a cowboy, or they wanted to be a airline pilot or whatever. But when they got to me, they asked me what I wanted to be, and I said I want to be my granddad. I'm going to be a granddad. And of course that got a few more questions, because that's not a normal answer. But the reality is that when you look at the life that people live, you really have two choices. You either look at it from the standpoint of what they did, or you look at it from the point of who they were or are. And my granddad was nothing if not a great gamesman. He was a cribbage player par excellence, and just was the center of localized attention. Whenever he got a chance to play, people would actually come out to compete with him at the local soda fountain. And the idea of being a grandpa was always something that appealed to me, not only from the standpoint of my grandfather retired early and therefore had plenty of time to do everything he wanted to do, which is, of course, the big reason to be a grandpa, but it's also about being able to be a mentor and a counselor for younger folks. And even when I was in first few years of college, I was really helping my younger friends who were still in high school make the transition to adulthood, so to speak, helping them to determine where they were going to go and what they were going to do. And role playing is a great way to do that, because even though it's a fantasy that you're engaged in, generally speaking, you do have the ability to convey to the other people how important their decision making is, and to help them develop new skills in communications and such. And really the major benefit of being a game master is that you already have a built-in perception, at least, of authority, even though you may not actually have any authority, so to speak. Nonetheless, in the case of the game, you are pretty much running it as the source supreme. Matter of fact, up until the most recent edition of Dungeons and Dragons, the very idea that the game master was the final arbiter really fed into that. The idea that if there was a decision that needed to be made and nobody could make it, it was the game master who had to resolve all conflicts and such. And that really sets you up, therefore, to be the mentor and guide for your games group. And that's fundamentally why I've done it for so many years. I think somebody calculated that somewhere between 10 and 12,000 people play role-play games now because of me, not only because of the public presentations, but the when I was working with Gamma and other organizations, I was endeavoring to promote gameplay and did larger scale presentations on the merits of role-play games in particular and gameplay in general. When you are playing a role-play game, granted, the people that sit at your table, if you're doing it, once a month for 7 months, it doesn't, build too much. But when you are running, as I do, 6 and 7 year campaigns with the same people, experiencing it throughout, you develop those friendships more into kinships. In other words, the people that play at my table are more than just friends of mine. They are fundamentally like family, because we share this deeper story, just as in the case of your actual family who knows your background and therefore knows your story. In the case of a role-play game, the players, if they've invested anything in the game, they are going to feel a kinship for the world, even if they don't necessarily for yourself. But the idea is that you build out deeper relationships with people because you're seeing them not only as they are, but more importantly, what they would want to be, what they would hope to be, and what they might someday be. And you're developing a lot more skills than you might expect. A friend of mine, Dr. Chrissy Mackey, actually has a PhD in utilizing the very concept that Dungeons and Dragons in particular improves your work ethics, your work product, so to speak, in your employment. So the idea that you're becoming more and becoming better and more complete than you would otherwise is one of the reasons why role-play games have always been what I've been interested in. And I've had a lot of other careers, and I think on one of these slides we'll talk about the background that I've had. But the reality is that I've known more people and talked to people more through role-play gaming than perhaps any other part of my adult livelihood, whether it be my career or social structures. It's just simply a way for us to communicate. And really, here we go back to a story. When I was a youngster, every holiday, every break from my dad and my mother and father's jobs always meant that we were going to go see relatives. We didn't take vacations to go see places or walk through and touch things. It was about the people, and it was about family. And so just about every holiday was a cousin's house or an uncle's house or whatever. And we were going there specifically to communicate and share with them, but almost always it meant that we were playing games. Usually 5 minutes of small talk and you're breaking out a table to play some form of cards or a board game or something. And that kind of set my mold so that as I became older, I did the same thing and interacted with people through the games that we played. Here we go. So one of the real elements of storytelling that I can attribute to an outside source is Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek, because he utilized the same elements from television going back time immemorial through all of the Lassies and the Shadows and shows like that. They all had their you see to me's. And of course, when I say that phrase, unless you know what I'm talking about, you're shaking your head going, what is it you see to me? So this is fundamentally based on the Lassie series. And in the Lassie series, inevitably, the child in the story, Timmy, would always go and get himself into trouble, either by finding something that was wrong that needed to be fixed, or himself getting into a bit of a bind and somebody having to rescue him. And the dog Lassie, of course, would go and try to warn people. And at the end of the show, after they resolved whatever the conflict was, then there was always Uncle Jim, and Uncle Jim would come and talk to Timmy and take Timmy by the shoulder and lead him out to the old split rail fence, and he'd say, well, in particular, Timmy would ask, why is this happening, or what caused this to occur? And Uncle Jim would just say, well, you see, Timmy, it used to be blah, blah, blah. And then he would give the justification for the story, the moral to the story, in a way that even somebody who didn't watch the entire episode could get kind of what had happened in the scenes, because he'd talk about how you shouldn't be messing with other people's wells, or you should be making sure that you cross at the intersections and not in the middle of the block, whatever. He would just give the moral of the story, and it was always, you see, Timmy, and so I call it you see to me's. And when you are a storyteller, you get the opportunity to not only tell a story, but then relate back what you were attempting to accomplish within the story. And I do that through what I call the debriefs. And I'm not as Johnny on the spot with as I used to be, but generally every time I have a game session, we usually have a break period where we actually talk about what the you see me's would be for that story, or what we might have gleaned from or taken from that story. Now, if I have a lot of younger players and have a lot of guidance that I provide in the story, then the you see to me's are more strong and more directed, whereas even in my more general groups, the world has certain physics and certain realities that the players have to work off of that eventually provide them with the information for the see to me's as well. But that is really part of it, is that yes, you're going to be providing mentorship and guidance, but if you do so in such a way that is just a fun, light way, you get more of a response from people than if you're too heavy-handed with it. So when we talk about storytelling, I relate here that it's older than RPGs, because going back, all the way back to the caveman days or the primitive days, most storytelling was oral tradition. It was carrying forward a lesson or a series of lessons based on the experiences of the past, whether they be of the actual speaker themselves, or if they were relating myths and fables from before. But the idea is that the storytelling has always been there, and almost all the time storytelling is a two-way communication. It's not just pontificating the facts of the history, but it's also a matter of discerning truths and sharing them back and forth. And that really is the heart of role play games. And so, because that predates the mechanism, the process that has kind of eviscerated the current role play games mechanism is simply that. We're no longer telling stories. We're no longer relating a tale. Instead, we are clicking a checkbox and saying we succeeded in gaining our treasure or whatever. The very method for storytelling has been diluted to the point where it doesn't have its teeth anymore. And I'm still of the old guard, and one of the reasons why I love telling stories is I feel there is still the necessity for us to learn from the past and to look at perhaps the things that happened in the past with new perspective, and therefore change the way the world in the future will respect those stories and keep the traditions alive. Okay, and then now you've got a pure selfishness. Awakening imaginations is addictive. There's nothing like watching somebody else's eyes light up when you give a description of a place or a time, and they're able to relate back to it and give you feedback on where they are, what they are doing within that scene. That is a very heady experience, especially when you talk about a newer player who hasn't had that experience before. When they suddenly get it, they finally see the universe you're talking about within the framework that you've provided. It's amazing, and that is, if there was nothing else, that would be the one reason to keep doing it, is simply because there is so much joy in seeing how the stories you relate fit into the mindset of others and watching them run with it into whatever the framework is that they want to pursue. Now down to the pragmatism of it. Public speaking is a skill and a fear for most people, simply because they haven't done it or haven't got any experience with it. And whether you are a game master or a player, public speaking confidence is unlocked when you play a role-play game, because you are now fundamentally speaking in front of an audience, whether that be an audience of 3 or an audience of 23. I've run games groups as large as 107 at the same time in a game, and when you have that many people's attention in your hand, it's a heady experience, but it's also terrifying, because if you, as a matter of fact, one of my great fears actually came about when I was running events for the the Gateway and OrcCon and Strategicon events down in LA, because I ran the first session and people loved it, and so then everything after that was me adding new material and trying new things, and every single time it was, oh gosh, I wonder if they're going to look at me, blink, and say, you thought that this would be interesting? That fear of what I call the blinkies is tough. Tough to overcome, but the reality is that the public speaking confidence becomes second nature when every week you are speaking in front of your 2 or 3 friends. Now granted, 2 or 3 friends, they're going to be sympathetic, they're going to give you a pass if you make a faux pas, they're going to give you critical analysis and feedback that in a loving way, because they're enjoying the gameplay and they just want to improve it in the future. So when you gain these skills, I think it's interesting that the world looks at role-play games and says, well, that was for people that were socially inept. And it's like, well, of course, if you're socially inept, gaming in a group and being public within the group is how you get training wheels to get out of being marginalized. And therefore we gain great improvements in our presence, our ability to present developing of our ideas, the coherency, all of these things are propagated in the game playing environment. And there's, to me, nothing like watching a new player step into the limelight for the first time, feel the searing heat of standing in front of everybody, recognizing it for what it is, and still bearing down and stepping into their role and presenting their case. There's nothing like it. And I highly advocate for anybody who's wanting to learn public speaking, take up role-play games, because it's a great way to learn improvisation, learn argumentation, learn sentence structure, and the very concept of creating ideas that you wish to convey are all part of what every role-play game session ever really should be. All right, so now we bring the button down with the toughest part of being a game master. To me, the toughest part of being a game master is to learn to shut it off. The idea of creating a world that is different enough from our world to be exciting, but similar enough to be appreciated is really the challenge. And that means looking at every engagement, every interaction from the standpoint of what it would be like if you were in the world. And we are fundamentally in the world. And the hardest part is to identify and convey the portions of what you're trying to say in a way that other people will hear it. I struggle with that every day on this channel because I've developed certain speech patterns and methodologies that have been off-putting to others in the past, and I'm striving to be a better storyteller than I've ever been before. And while I have come quite a way at 50 years of experience having done it, there's still more to be learned. And so my question to you, of course, is what's the toughest part to you for being a game master? What would you want to do differently if you could to make your game sessions more exciting and more engaging and more challenging, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And if you're a player, what's the biggest challenge you have with game masters? Are there situations that you feel where a game master oversteps his limits? Are there places where the players should have more agency? I'd love to hear all of that. And do remember that we're here 5 days a week, right here at Nikos RPG on Twitch, and also at Nikos RPG on YouTube whenever I get them uploaded. Thank you again for being here today, and I will see you in the next episode. And remember, my grandfather always said, "That's enough work. That's enough work." I got to say it 2 or 3 times. Got to say it right. That's enough work. Go play.